So hi, everyone. My name is Heather Barrett. I am the Science Communication Director and a sea otter biologist for Sea Otter Savvy. And I was asked to maybe give a little bit more information of how I got there and who I am. And so it is right. I started my undergraduate degree at UC Santa Cruz, and I became interested in the marine ecosystem, mainly because in Santa Cruz, it's so close. So originally I thought I was going to go terrestrial, and then being there made it really clear that I wanted to learn more about the marine ecosystem. And I had the privilege of being able to assist an intern with the Jim Estes and Tim Tinker lab there at UC Santa Cruz, which really focused on sea otter work. And then did a sort of internship through the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and later went back and got my master's at Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, where I investigated the energetic cost of human disturbance to sea otters with Sea Otter Savvy, and really, I think, sparked my interest in sort of these issues of human sea otter conflicts. So with that, I'm going to introduce today a little bit about our We Were Here Sea Otter program, and I'm going to touch on sea otter history, as well as the current recovery discussions and some of the common questions surrounding potential reintroduction and the importance of community outreach on this topic. But before I jump in, I do want to take a moment and familiarize everyone with Sea Otter Savvy. So up in Mendocino, you might not have heard of us, but we're hopefully going to be changing that today. So we are a sea otter research and outreach nonprofit. We are based out of Moss Landing, though we do work all on the Central California coast. And our mission is to foster awareness and stewardship in communities and those viewing wildlife to reduce human conflicts such as disturbance and increase an ethic of coexistence. So to accomplish this, we focus our efforts in research. We engage with communities, and we provide science-based educational outreach, and we pride ourselves with our extensive network of partners and collaborating organizations. And so we're so excited that NOIA is having us here today, and we can extend and become partners in future as well. Collaboration really is the core of Sea Otter Savvy's ethos. So to the right, you can just see some of our highlighted projects and programs. We have many, but today I really do want to focus on our outreach program to stakeholders surrounding the conversation of sea otter recovery and some of the questions around potential reintroduction. So some people kind of wonder, well, how did Sea Otter Savvy get, involved in this? And so Sea Otter Savvy has been playing catch up, okay? Addressing the issue of human sea otter interactions in regions of Central California where sea otters and people overlap. And we're trying to walk back bad recreational habits that threaten wild sea otters. And we want to create an accurate understanding of sea otter behavior to better prevent and mitigate interactions and human-related conflicts. And so this is why we feel working to foster a stewardship ethic in recreation industries, as well as having a better understanding of sea otters within communities and different stakeholder groups well in advance of any sea otter's arrival to historical range, will help us get in front with messaging and outreach. And it's really offering us the opportunity to create a strong foundation of savvy communities prior to any sea otters returning, however that may be, whether it be through natural range expansion or potential reintroduction effort. So with this talk, it's a little different for me. I haven't done this talk before. So with this, I really wanted to start at the very beginning and build a foundation in some of the terms and methods that surround species recovery. So as stated by NOAA Fisheries, recovery is the process of restoring endangered and threatened species to a point where they no longer require the safeguards of the Endangered Species Act. So a recovery plan then serves as a roadmap for species recovery. And it's important to note that every species is unique, and a recovery plan would be specific to that species. And there are many different tools in a recovery plan. So for example, management and protections can promote recovery through natural range expansion, like that's been done for the northern elephant seal, while in other cases, a reintroduction of a species may be determined necessary, for example, like the American bison. So that brings into question, well, what is reintroduction? So from the dictionary, it is the action of putting a species back into a former habitat. But if we want to focus more on the goals and elaborate on that, the goal of species reintroduction is to establish a healthy, genetically diverse, self-sustaining population to an area where it has been extirpated. And that's just a big word to say that they have been previously removed. So wildlife reintroductions are a tool. wildlife reintroductions is a tool that we can use. So if a reintroduction should even be considered, is really, it's determined, it's when it's determined is most effective to deliver a nationally agreed recovery goal for that species. Okay, so that means that the potential harms are outweighed by the potential benefits, as well as that the reintroduction would complement other conservation actions and efforts for that species. So I really want to make sure it's extremely important to recognize that a reintroduction is not indicated just because it's technically feasible, right? So project leaders, they have to assess whether it's appropriate and desirable to do so. And so a key principle of reintroduction is that the reasons for the original loss of the species should be reversed. So if expanding a bit more into some of the complexities of reintroduction, there are many logistical, biological, and social aspects to consider. So for example, just determining the method of sourcing individuals for that effort comes with pros and cons. To reestablish a population in the wild, animals could be sourced from captivity, or they could be moved or translocated from areas in the wild. Now, if one's considering a translocation, and that's when you move individuals from an existing wild population to a new site where the species was formerly removed, you have to consider what life stage should the animals be collected? Is the habitat suitable? All while recognizing that, these individuals already established somewhere. And so when you move them, it's no guarantee that they would remain in that area chosen. Transporting wild animals can cause stress and has potential health risks associated. And this all can impact attrition, which is the loss of individuals during a relocation effort. Now, in other situations where wild collection of individuals is not feasible or recommended, you can source from captivity. And that's moving individuals from an in-house facility like a zoo or an aquarium. And in some cases, this may be a preferred method. So this also comes with some of the above considerations, of course. However, being able to obtain the optimal number of individuals to sustain a new population for reintroduction might be a concern. So are there enough individuals in captivity to do this? So there are many important factors to consider when reintroducing a species. We touched on the source population, deciding on the most suitable life history stage, determining numbers, how many do you need, habitat quality. There's, of course, genetic considerations, long-term monitoring and feasibility, how is success determined, and of course, those socioeconomic costs and benefits. We are definitely part of this picture as well. So the takeaway from this is that reintroduction, it really can be a useful and a powerful tool in the recovery of a species, and it has been for specific species, but it is a complex process and it really requires significant considerations. So why sea otters? Why are sea otters even associated with this discussion of potential reintroduction? And it really comes down to their history and current status and management of this species. So pre-European colonization, and this may not be new news to anyone, but it is really important in this story. The worldwide sea otter population was estimated to be between 150,000 to 300,000 individuals. And their range, you can see in this map, is in black, okay, that whole black line. So sea otters and humans coexisted along the Pacific for thousands of years, and sea otters have a strong cultural significance for many coastal communities. However, following the arrival of Alaska of Russian explorers in 1741, there was extensive commercial harvesting of sea otters in the maritime fur trade for about 150 years, and that resulted in the near extirpation of the species. So when sea otters were finally afforded protection, and that was by the International Fur Seal Treaty in 1911, there were probably fewer than 2,000 individuals that remained across 13 different colonies. And those different colonies are shown as those red circles. And you can see there's one little red circle here in California. But to give a little bit of perspective, I wanted to share this quote from Rivali's book, Sea Otter, A History. And it states, in 1807 was the most bloody year for the California sea otter, as at least 8 different vessels carried an estimated 9,784 pelts from the coast. So this really emphasizes the numbers lost along, and that's just one year, 1807, that emphasizes the numbers lost along California coastline in a relatively short amount of time. And here we can now see the current range in yellow on this map and historic ranges in red. And I've highlighted the southern sea otters range to the right. So there are 3 recognized subspecies of sea otters. There's the Eurasian, the northern, and the southern sea otter. And in North America, we have the northern and the southern. But moving forward, I'm really only going to be discussing the southern sea otter, or we can also call it the California sea otter. So the southern sea otter's current range extends from Gaviota up to approximately Pigeon Point, which is a little bit north of Nuevo State Park. And the heat map that you're looking at, it's showing density. So the red zones, those darker zones, are the areas with the highest number of sea otters. And the current California sea otter population is approximately 3,000 individuals. But you can see that they are still missing from large sections in Northern and Southern California. So the southern sea otter is listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And this is because of reduced range, the population size we just talked about, and there's also vulnerability to oil spills from coastal tanker traffic. Sea otters rely heavily on their fur. So if that was to get soiled, it can drastically impact their survival. And as a consequence of their threatened status, southern sea otters are also recognized as depleted under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And that protects all marine mammals in US waters. And then the US Fish and Wildlife Service manages sea otters under both the ESA and the MMPA. So now what's been in current news is the US Fish and Wildlife Service was directed by Congress to look at the feasibility and the cost of reintroducing sea otters to the Pacific coast. And that included Oregon, Washington, and California. And this directive stemmed from language that was included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act for 2021. And the feasibility assessment is available. I believe the link might be made available to you now. If not, I'm sure there's a way that we'll be able to get all these different links that I mentioned to you guys. And it was concluded that reintroduction would result in significant conservation benefits to the species, in particular to the threatened southern sea otter, as well to the nearshore marine ecosystem. But it also definitely indicates that there's a need for a comprehensive socioeconomic impact assessment. And so I do want to emphasize that the feasibility assessment was merely to determine if reintroduction is feasible, right? Biologically, legally, financially, could it be done? It is not an official proposal for action. So that distinction is really important for people to make, because I know media sometimes takes things and runs with it. So that sort of brings into some of the questions that we get around, well, what's happening with natural range expansion? You know, with all this protection, why is reintroduction being considered and discussed when they could just potentially expand their range for the southern sea otter? Well, natural range expansion for the southern sea otter has not occurred for almost 20 years. And though there are no sure answers, there are hypotheses, and there's likely a variety of different factors. It is possible that at the northern part of the range, this is due in part to 3 things. And I like to break it down to geography, behavior, and predation. So a combo of those. So north of Año Nuevo, which was that furthest north of their current range, there is a sandy bottom that doesn't facilitate kelp forest growth, right? So kelp requires to have that rocky substrate to grow. And so there's a long sandy stretch there. So there isn't going to be kelp. And then plus our Northern California kelp forests, which you guys are very much familiar with, are not consistent and have been in a bit of a state of crisis. So they're kind of a long stretch of no refuge. Secondly, we know that female sea otters, this is the behavior side, female sea otters need places of refuge like kelp and eelgrass, and they have strong site fidelity. And what that means is that they don't like to go very far from home. I don't really like to go far from home either, so I guess that makes sense. But movements are risky for them, right? Especially if they're reproductive, and females are risk averse, and that's unlike some younger males. And so it's not uncommon in young male mammals to be the ones to go explore. And so there are cases of young male sea otters, observed north exploring, being bold explorers further north than that. But without females, there's really no reason for them to stay. And so they tend to return back. And lastly, the main cause for sea otter mortality in recent years, which I think was just talked about for the otter that you have in-house, has been white shark bites. So Año Nuevo is an elephant seal rookery, and those young elephant seals are quite tasty for white sharks. And research shown that juvenile white sharks begin to hunt marine mammals in what they call their teen years, They start transitioning. So with poor eyesight and sort of learning curve with a curious bite, this actually leaves sea otters with a bit of a gauntlet to cross, and nowhere safe to go for quite a long distance. So these are just some of the possible reasons of why natural range expansion has not been occurring, especially in that northern end. And we're seeing, and at the same time, we're seeing density increase, likely to carrying capacity at range center, sort of in areas like Monterey Bay, which leads to increased competition among these individuals, reduced prey availability, and that can lead to poor body condition and, of course, increased stress on reproductive females. So that's always been sort of a consideration as well. So I think another question that we get that's sort of related to this is how might sea otters impact communities? And I've broken this question down into two separate categories because we have ecological communities and implications that we can discuss, as well as human communities and some of the socioeconomic implications as well. So first, we're just going to touch on the ecological implications. So sea otters are considered a keystone species, which means that they are an animal that has a large scale community effect disproportionate to their abundance. So just with one sea otter, they can have a big impact. And the term, it stems from architecture. So the keystone, or that center stone, is putting pressure down, and those other stones are putting pressure up. And that creates an arch. So when the keystone is removed, the remaining stones fall. And it's an analogy that the ecological community is altered. So those interactions may disappear or they may change completely. But the reason sea otters are a keystone species is directly tied to their unique physiology. They need to consume large quantities of prey each day. And they are recent additions to the marine environment, evolutionarily speaking. So they don't store fat as blubber, and they rely on their fur and extremely, high metabolism to stay warm in the cold ocean. So you're looking at an infrared image of a sea otter. And it's really, I wanted to give you all a sense of how much heat sea otters lose to the cold water. You can see the heat trail and the areas where they're losing the most heat, the areas around the eyes, nose, ears, paws. And this is just to emphasize that sea otters run hot. Okay, so they have extremely high metabolic rates to make sure that they can maintain that internal temperature despite cold water. And it's this need to keep fuel in their tank, per se, that has them consuming over a quarter of their body weight in food each day. So it is that need to stay warm that influences their keystone role in their ecosystem. So as a keystone species, there are two examples of how they influence nearshore communities, specifically in California. And that's with kelp forests on the left and eelgrass communities on the right. Now, I do want to note that this is a very simplified interaction for visual purposes. This is a more complete depiction of a California coastal food web. And I'm going to thank USGS for this great visual. And it's really emphasizing that California is much more complex. You can see all those lines there on that right side. So the right side's California, the left side's Alaska. California is much more complex of a food web than Alaska, for example. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. California is extremely diverse. And so all of those different species have different interactions in there. But for today, we are simplifying for visual purposes because even though there is increased complexity in California, sea otters do still exhibit strong effects in our coastal communities. And this has been shown repeatedly. Now, the other thing I want to note about this is that California kelp forest may have more than one keystone species, perhaps a keystone mesopredator, that, like the sunflower sea star, that can serve as a buffer in areas that have been missing sea otters historically, so up in your region. And it has been through the loss of the sunflower stars due to sea star wasting disease that aspects of this ecological complexity has begun to come to light. And Dr. Joshua Smith has done a great job investigating this topic. But regardless of the sunflower star, impact of sea otters is still significant in our nearshore communities. So with the presence of sea otters, urchin populations are regulated, allowing kelp to grow. You can see that on the left, as are crabs and eelgrass communities on the right. So if I move forward, now I've removed sea otters, the trophic cascades change and that biomass changes. Okay, you saw that visual change of the biomass. In kelp forests, urchin populations increase and limit growth, which can result in urchin barrens, which you can see a photo there when there's no predator, keeping them in check. While similarly for eelgrass communities and estuaries, an increased crab population actually consumes the sea slugs, and that releases algae from pressure from the sea slugs, and that ends up smothering eelgrass. So there's one more step in that one, but that can restrict growth. That smothering of the eelgrass means they're not able to get light, and so that restricts growth and can definitely impact eelgrass beds. And ultimately, these ecological communities in certain areas along the Pacific coast, we've been experiencing altered systems for quite a while. So research has shown again and again that there are positive benefits for the biological community as a whole with the presence of sea otters. With their presence and that foraging pressure we talked about that's regulating those grazers, there's increased biodiversity that can benefit some fin fisheries. There's increased carbon storage. More kelp and eelgrass means that there's more carbon that's being sequestered and stored. That has larger climate implications as well as storm and flooding protection, as well as potential economic benefits for us. And so that's my segue into some of the implications for humans. Now, with any species recovery comes with costs and benefits. So some of the economic benefits, as just mentioned, related to tourism and recreation industry, local businesses, communities, they've shown to experience economic gains in areas with sea otters than areas without. People love to come visit and sort of participate in this sort of recreation and tourism around sea otters. But it also, for carbon sequestration, this falls both under ecological implications and human, because the potential for increased carbon sequestration, that storing of carbon through kelp and seagrasses, has larger impacts for humans and our communities overall by reducing atmospheric carbon and helping to mitigate impacts of climate change. And then, of course, there are some ecological benefits increased with biodiversity, and that can benefit certain fin fisheries as habitats are restored and biodiversity and species numbers increase. Examples are economically and culturally valuable upper trophic level finfish. Now, of course, there are implications as well to cultural significance for coastal tribal communities as well. But not all social and economic benefits disperse equally with a species reintroduction, and this is something we need to make sure is definitely touched on. So commercial shellfish like crab and urchin fisheries are at potential risk. So as recovering sea otters transform, these coastal systems that we're talking about by reducing that population of those benthic invertebrates, those like urchins, and releasing kelp forests from that grazing pressure, there's going to be changes, and those changes are likely to occur and then can potentially threaten established shellfish fisheries that have been established sort of in this system that's been missing sea otters for so long. And this needs to be recognized as a potential economic cost. And then, of course, there's a subset of fisheries and aquaculture that actually might provide insights to some methods of mitigating potential conflicts through infrastructure changes, new methods, interesting new technologies, sort of out-of-the-box ideas. So, for example, there are shellfish farms like the Monterey Bay Abalone Company and Grassy Bar Oyster Company that successfully farm in sea otter habitats. And these methods and types of infrastructure could actually be quite useful in discussions for businesses and regions without sea otters that may potentially one day see them return. So we get this question a lot. And so this is the question that's asked a lot. And the simplest answer is there is no official locations. Okay, all discussions occurring around potential reintroduction are conceptual at this point. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service feasibility assessment did focus on Northern California and Oregon, and they did this because scientists identified that Northern California and Oregon have suitable habitat to support sea otters, and this area constitutes that sort of largest remaining gap between historical range. So you can see that red zone here between the little yellow in California and up in Washington. That is the largest gap that we still have from historic range. So historically, sea otters were distributed continuously along the North Pacific Rim. And Oregon was serving as a transitional zone between the two subspecies, right? So we have the northern sea otter up north, we have the southern sea otter. They are two subspecies that we see distinctly. there was likely to have this transition zone genetically between them. So reintroducing sea otters to Northern California and Oregon would help increase genetic diversity and long-term sustainability of sea otters in the wild by beginning to reconnect both the northern sea otter and the southern sea otter subspecies. But any location also requires extensive analysis and considerations, those biological factors and impacts, as well as socioeconomic impacts. Also urbanization, coastlines are busy. There's a lot of us now. And so there are different types of habitats to be considered. You have nearshore kelp habitats, like the one that you can see on the left, as well as bay and estuarine habitats like the one in the right. And sometimes those can provide more refuge. So through Dr. Brent Hughes' work, we have a better understanding of how sea otters use estuarine and eelgrass habitats such as Elkhorn Slough and Moss Landing. So while sea otters are closely associated with kelp forests, historical and paleo-ecological evidence, so there's evidence that makes it clear that southern sea otters were once abundant in California estuaries as well. So, much of our knowledge of sea otters and where they inhabit and what is their habitat is based on where they survived, where they're able to hide to make it through that fur trade. And so what we can, what we are understanding is where they survived, as well as what we can determine from historical records. So for example, from Ogden's book, The California Sea Otter Trade, it says, states the San Francisco Bay abounded in otters. Apparently, they not only swam around the bay, but frequented the numerous estuaries and even hauled up on shore. So this sort of, again, emphasizes there's always so much more to learn in the conversation around potential reintroduction and just sea otter recovery in general. There are no crystal balls. We can understand sort of what research has been done and look at that, but each case can be so specific and unique. But that's why open discussions like this are really important, and sort of those what if questions are really, really important to have. So what is needed? And that's another, like, what do people always ask, like, well, what can I do? What is needed? So what's needed is you guys. We need your voices. It's important to understand the history, the ecology, as well as the biological and economic impacts, those costs and benefits that we just touched on. They need to be discussed. And so you guys are actually just being here already in that phase one to learn, which is excellent. And then you can also choose to participate and share your voice, as each one of you is a stakeholder. And so now I want to introduce you to our We Were Here Sea Otter program. And so we began this in 2020, early 2020, after learning about the need for more outreach to communities and stakeholders about potential reintroduction. We really wanted to have a bold message. We were here to spark curiosity about sea otter history and engage with the public. It was surprising to learn that many people weren't aware that sea otters ever were supposed to exist in Northern California and Oregon, right? And others actually just thought they still were there. And sometimes river otters go into the marine environment too, and that can confuse people too. But yeah, they have something that's been missing for a long, long time. And so the goals of the program fall into three categories. The first is education. So the program provides sea otter history and offers information on the ecological implications of the species. The second is outreach. So we really want to build community awareness, and in some cases, stewardship within communities that are missing sea otters. And the third is engagement. We're offering stakeholders a way to participate with a tool to voice their perspectives, and that's concerns, support, questions, ideas, and that's all done through a digital survey. So I want to note that this program is designed to strictly offer information, okay? We're not advocating for anything. This is a way for all stakeholders to share their voices, whether it be pro or con, and we want to hear from everyone. So this is just to give you a little sense of what was going on with the survey now and some of the output that we do have. So as mentioned, we're offering direct access to sharing personal thoughts, questions, concerns about reintroduction and potential reintroduction through the stakeholder survey. The survey questions were reviewed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service members. So these are questions that they would like initially asked to the public, and all of our results are shared. Of course, you may wonder, how are we identifying stakeholders? And the reality is, for this type of survey, we don't. The survey is designed so that each person identifies themselves as a stakeholder. There are many categories of stakeholders offered, and we feel it's not our place to predetermine for you that what stakeholder you feel that you are. So there's also an option to add a new one in. As natural resources are held in public trust in the United States, all citizens have a stake in sea otters. So you are all stakeholders. Now, the survey is a way for an individual to actively participate in this conversation without having to wait for an invitation. Though I will also say that I've used it as a way to invite specific stakeholder representatives or those that we would really like to talk to begin conversations and build relationships, and so we can have these discussions. Some of the questions are specific and labeled, others are open-ended, and they allow for full commentary. It also allows for an individual to add their email. So if you would like to be contacted for future potential reintroduction related information, you can be added to that as well. And so we're able to compile that first level contact list. So what you're seeing here now are the different stakeholder groups. You can also see thus far, general public does make up almost half the results thus far. So if you are not seeing more representation in your specific group that you feel should be represented more, I urge you to take the survey and share it with others. Now, though the survey is offered and spread through various, media methods, the best way is through you guys as representatives, as sort of people taking it to the other stakeholders. So I wanted to highlight, that those taking the survey are taking time and in many cases offering really thoughtful and diverse perspectives, comments, and concerns. And each of these are representing meaningful engagements. So for example, one states the importance of aquaculture to feed people needs to be popularized, just as healthy oceans feed those cute sea otters. A healthy ocean can help the sea otter population and reduce the need for scarce water and harmful chemicals that commercial land aquaculture has become reliant on. Another says, as a person who comes from the heartland, trust me, I am mainly coming to spend money in coastal communities in order to see wildlife. The more places with sea otters, the more places people travel and stay. And then another said, I am a commercial fisherman and I'm threatened by closures all the time. To be displaced by an otter relocation program would end my ability to provide for my family. So all of these are really important and valid comments, and they need to be collected. And these each are touching on different topics that need to be and can be discussed in this, future looking at potential reintroduction. So here's my soapbox. We want to hear from you. So if you have not taken the stakeholder survey, I urge you to participate and share your thoughts. I do recommend when you take it, it is best to be as thoughtful as possible. If there are specific questions you have or concerns or things that you would like to be seen, you can bullet point those in sort of those long text boxes. So the more information you're able to provide is better for those in these discussions around potential reintroduction to address those, as opposed to just sort of the one-liner, yay. We want to make sure we're actually getting good feedback and sort of where you guys are at with what you guys are thinking. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge those that we collaborate with through this process, and a special thank you to the Noyo Center for hosting me this evening. If you have any questions, comments, or contacts to share with me, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think we have some time. Let's see. Oh, good. We still have about like 20 minutes. So if you're interested, we can talk now. I do have a QR code up that will take you directly to the website. So there are links for the We Were Here Sea Otter website, and the links directly that can take you to the survey. And I don't know if Trey might put those into the chat box as well. Otherwise, we can make sure we get those to you at the end. And if you're interested in accessing any of the research or papers that I was referencing, I'm happy to share that list with Noyo as well, that can be shared out with you. But with that, I think I'll stop sharing my screen and join you guys back in the room.
Wonderful, Heather. Thank you.
Yeah, of
There
course.
we go. That was just beautifully presented and concise and really packed with good information. And the chat box was lighting up. And I will do my best to get through these questions. Hello to you from Sea Otter Reintroduction Alliance. Please find us on Facebook. So Steve Aviv Kleinman, who is here in the audience, has been really vocal here locally. He's brought up his thoughts and ideas in passing over the year or so. So he's happy to be here and learn and discuss. So he's saying hello, and then
Hi, Steve. It's great to see you here. Thank you for joining in the talk. And absolutely love to be able to share more information and have people that are helping us spread the survey. So thank you so much.
Great. And I'll kind of read through these, and then if we have a minute after that too, if people want to chime in before toddler time. Gowan is a local farmer who has had to really get to know mountain lions
Oh, wow.
up close and personal. Females rarely migrate from far from where they are born. Sight.
Yeah, it's common in mammals. It's actually, yeah, it's interesting. And that sort of the young males are the ones to go be bold explorers. But yeah, you don't have, you always come back to the ladies
Yeah,
in the end.
yeah, exactly. Okay, here's a question. Why is it taking so long to reintroduce them? So that I wonder, Lawrence, yeah, why is it taking so long? I think that I'll let you answer that directly, even though you kind of been discussing that. But
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that it's something that's definitely, people want to know. So there's two sides of the coin. Some people are like, oh, I really want to know why this isn't happening faster. And I tried to, I think, to address that a little bit at the beginning, which is that, reintroduction is a term that's thrown around really easily and simplest, like it sounds simple in sort of media, but the reality of how it plays out and the amount of planning that it would take is quite complex. And there's a lot of different things that have to be considered. And it's a tool, right? And so when you're doing a job, not every tool is best used for that job. So in recovery, there are different methods. You can have natural range expansion. We sort of touched on why that's been an issue for sea otters. So now that they're having potential conversations around potential reintroduction, we have to consider where's the source population. So that was an example I kind of gave early on is, well, where would we be getting them from? And some of the concerns around that. So if you are talking about a translocation, that involves consideration of individuals, like what age class, who are you going to be taking from, where from. It's very stressful. It's an idea that some of these individuals are very established where they are. So you can kind of imagine it's like abduction, right? You're abducting them and putting them somewhere new. And if that happened to you, it would be very stressful too. So we also have to take into account sort of the ethics around that. For these species, they are threatened. And so that needs to be really forefront of this as well. And there are obviously, history of reintroduction and translocations in the past as well. But I think we can always do better and learn from that. And then, of course, from captive surrogacy programs like at Monterey Bay Aquarium, they're involved a lot in this discussion as well, of course. And then that just sort of was another conversation that, kind of put under there was, well, how many individuals do you need to start a population? And so that's sort of, there has to be a lot of research and pilot studies and sort of really looking at that. So to really make sure that we're doing this correctly and make sure we're doing this safely for the otters, as well as for the different communities that might be considered, is really important. You don't want to botch this. This isn't something that you just want to do and make a mess. And so it's really important for everyone involved to take the time that it needs to take to answer these different questions. And so that's my answer to why it would be taking sort of a long time. Reintroduction is complex and it requires a lot of minds and science and community members to come together to have these discussions.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather, for circling back to that. And, we have learned so much about throwing something at fixing a situation. I mean, we're faced with it all the time with the barred owl and the spotted owl, with the condors.
Yeah.
And at least, I mean, I kind of celebrate that we're where we're at today and that we can stop and think, before we throw something at it and, think it through, and that there are so many scientists looking at the complexities of all of these issues. So that just thinking about it, just taking pause to learn more I'm glad we're there.
Yeah.
Where is there enough kelp, or where is there enough kelp anywhere on the coast for sea otters to live on? Like, is there, I think Scott's asking, like, Scott's from Point Arena, and I look out at his kelp beds and I'm jealous. And he's just 45 minutes to the south, and yet their kelp beds are really, they look better than ours. They're nothing like they were historically. But up
Right.
here, if I look out at our kelp beds, I'm like, okay, that's not very much space for an otter right now, or last year or the year before, but maybe we're where would there be dense enough kelp forest north of, say, San Francisco?
Absolutely. And that's an excellent question. I personally am not a kelp ecologist or biologist or, focused on kelp restoration. So this is why we start reaching out and we're talking to other researchers in those fields to make sure that they're part of this conversation. Because I think first step of anything is looking at where is sort of the biologically, where could sea otters go? And it is true that, sea otters do need some refuge. And so kelp is definitely that big question along Northern California coast, with it sort of being in crisis at the moment. But that's why I think I brought up the idea of, in this question of where, right, is in the discussion, there are open coast sites. Sea otters obviously do live on open coast and near shore, and they do that where there are healthy kelp beds, and sea otters will likely have an impact on sort of kelp restoration as well, or potentially could. But there's also estuaries. And so I brought that in because there's been more current research looking at estuaries as possibilities for, historical habitat. And we now know, which I think is all sort of new, right? So in the past, we're like, well, sea otters live here because that's where we saw them. But a lot of them have been gone for so long. So finding sort of that historical records and getting a better understanding that sea otters were in these bays, they were in these estuaries, they were using pickleweed, they were helping with eelgrass, and sort of in those marshlands, is really interesting. And so those sort of habitats are a little bit different, and different sort of prey and different sort of aspect, but sea otters is still having that keystone sort of influence in those as well. And so I think in any conversation that's occurring with potential reintroduction is looking at estuaries as well as a potential safe haven to start looking at as well. So, yeah.
So exciting to be looking at the estuaries, because we like the Albion estuary and Big River estuary, that are places that are just, really pretty pristine now, in terms of locations where you can almost just fantasize about there being otters there helping with the eelgrass and helping that, with the kelp beds and everything.
Yeah.
It gets exciting. As my intern was working on the sea otter articulation, what about Big River? Wouldn't that be great? We got super excited about it. So, I mean, at least, it's being talked about. So Lawrence is asking, why so complicated? They have always been here. They have always been an important part of the ecosystem. We wiped them out. We should restore our ecosystem. We never had surveys to reintroduce bald eagles. And the bald eagles are doing great. But I think that we have been talking about that just in terms of fisheries that are here that didn't used to be. Kelp forest changed that. It's different from what it used to be. And just you're welcome to take that again, Heather, and pull it apart further.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And I think it's always good to also recognize that, at the very beginning, when I kind of talked about recovery plans and that aspect, is every species is a little different, and about how their habitat use, behavior, their history, and recovery plans are specific to that species. So if in a recovery plan reintroduction is recommended, that type of reintroduction plan would be very specific to that species. So sea otters, because of their behavior, because of that sort of keystone aspect and that connection with kelp forest and needing refuge, and sort of, again, people ask that chicken egg, right? Do you need kelp before you have a sea otter? Do you need a sea otter before you get kelp? It makes it complex. And so I'm assuming that with bald eagles, it was complex. And I'm sure there were plans and something that went into that. I'm not familiar with that in that case. But I would say that for sea otters specifically, for the biologists and those that are working on this, it's very complex, and there's a lot that we need to consider. And again, we have to consider individual sea otters, right? They are threatened species, and so we want to make sure that anything that we're doing, we're not having that high attrition, which is that loss of individuals in a reintroduction. And so with the fact that it's on marine overlapping with people, there are other industries to be considered. That's a big part too.
For sure. And our red urchin harvesters and abalone harvesters, it's just been such a big whiplash these last 10 years, as we all know. It's just been such a crazy
It's been really tough for them.
Yeah. And the urchins that we crack open, the purple urchins, are like pretty empty. But then again, if I go to Big River and crack them open, I'm eating them and they're delicious. And there is there is some viability to the purples, but not as much as there once was. And so, we're just in a time of change. So it's great that we're having these discussions. And number one, that we realize that it is complex, and acknowledging the complexity of that balance is why you're here, Heather. Jenna says, thank you. That was a great presentation. Helen is wondering, is there competition between those areas wishing to reintroduce sea otters? We want them up here, so never mind anyone else.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I haven't necessarily experienced or noticed sort of competition. I will say that there are communities and that have put letters of support to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I will say that that is something everyone can do. You can do letters of support, or a letter of that you don't want them, but letters to, these official representatives are an important way of sharing your voice as well. And so I do know that, City of Emeryville wrote a letter of support. Sonoma County with Representative Hopkins wrote a letter of support. I know that the Tolowadeni up further north is one of the tribal groups that we work with and partner with, are interested. I have had some conversation with the Kashaya. So I do think that there are multiple groups and organizations and communities that are interested in this. And if they feel strongly, my comment would be to make sure that you're taking the survey to include those locations if you have a recommendation to be considered, as well as, writing letters of support or not support to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I'm happy to share more details on that with Noyo to get that to you guys as well.
I think we'll go ahead and have a lot of those, the survey and different things available on our website going, going forward, so people can take the next month or so to definitely hit that survey and continue the discussion as much as possible with links and whatnot. Someone says that they missed the beginning. Abby missed the beginning. Oops, where'd it go? Is there any way to get an email if the recording is, I don't get that's being covered up? If the recording, when we finish, we're gonna, Abby, we're gonna record, this is recorded, and Trey will have it up on our YouTube channel, like other science talks. So you can definitely go back to that. And then, like I said, we'll put the resources up for people to reach out and do the survey and whatnot. We love mountain lions and sea otters at Fortunate Farm. Yes, absolutely. Both so important. Thank goodness we don't have a bunch of sickly deer running around, because we've got a nice healthy mountain lion population. And then, do sea otters target and eat abalone as their diet?
So that's a great question, Grant. Thank you for asking that. And I'm glad to see you here. So sea otters, sea otters will eat things that are available to them. But we also know that sea otters can be specialists. And so what that means is that sea otters start to learn and become very specialized in a particular type of prey, and that allows them to be very efficient. And again, it all comes back to their physiology and the fact that they are trying to consume a lot to stay warm. And so, for example, you can have one that specializes in clams, and they are really good at finding and bottle capping clams. And that just means that they're really efficient. So then there are individuals that would likely be more prone and focused on abalone. I would say that any sea otter, if they happen upon an abalone, is likely going to eat an abalone if it's easy to access. Something to consider, though, is that abalone are harder to pry off. So it does create more effort to get an abalone than it would be to other prey items as well. So I guess the answer is a little complex. Like, it depends on the individual, but I also think that, if it's an easily accessible abalone, I don't think a sea otter is just going to swim by it. But with that said, abalone in areas where there was a research project done, and I can add that to the list for Noyo to share as well, from Ramundi on abalone and sea otters present, and that with sea otters, abalone would be more in sort of these refuges and crevices and allow them to grow to larger sizes and become more reproductive. So that was a really interesting study. I'm happy to share that one as well. But yes, the otters eat abalone. They love those shellfish.
Yeah. And will sea otters eat empty purple urchins out of urchin barrens? Right.
Yeah, no. So it's I've heard this, and I've seen even like a little clip before. It's amazing that sea otters just know. It's not even like they go pick them up and test it. They just know that they're going straight to find the urchin that is still has uni and is, you know, very healthy. But what's interesting, and this was really featured in, I mentioned Dr. Joshua Smith's work, and hopefully that paper will be added to the website as well, is was looking at how sea otters were really helping to buffer that bite, even though they weren't eating the sort of slow or zombified, you know, ones that didn't have the uni and the sort of centers of these barrens. Sea otters were assisting kelp sort of regrowth and you know, restriction from the barrens by eating the ones at the edge that were still healthy and having access to the kelp, right? So the ones that are at the edge still eating and allowing themselves to have more uni, those are the ones getting picked off. And so in his particular study was finding that more sea otters were becoming focused on urchins during that period of time in Monterey and were assisting with reducing the urchin barrens at that. But yes, so sea otters will not eat it's not worth them to eat the crunchy bits. They're going for the uni just like we are.
Exactly. That's a nice image though, getting the bigger urchins that are out at the edge ready to feast on the next kelp. How would river and sea otters do in the same environment? I'm sure you're
That's an
familiar with
excellent
that.
question. I get that one a lot. And I chatted, actually had a good conversation with some of you know, friends and colleagues that do work with river otters. And you know, I think for the most part, they can overlap. Obviously, there are river otters that use the marine environment too, and that's the same up in Alaska and through British Columbia. And they have, you know, have hardy sea otter populations. And from my understanding is that there's very little contact. I think that they just do their own thing. I will say that river otters come in packs, right? So they have their family groups, and they can be I wouldn't want to mess with them. And I doubt that a sea otter would. I mean, I think they're foraging on different things. They're focused on different things. I think that, you know, if there was interesting interactions, it would probably be because of certain individuals and in certain circumstances. But for the most part, you know, historically, they would have been there for a very long time together. So.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Gabriella, who lives down on the Albion River, in a beautiful estuary, one of our treasures. And she's asking that same question about the river otters and the sea otters. It's neat to watch from Slack Tide Cafe. We have the sea lions, the otters, and the harbor seals just really just moving past each other, and throw a sea otter in that mix. And, you know, they're kind of, who knows? I mean, you see, I don't know how the river otter population is in Monterey. Certainly river otter population up here seems to be doing pretty well. I think we have like a pack of 8 or 9 camping out under the Slack Tide Cafe, and you see them all tumbling out. And I know there's a scientist at Humboldt State doing a demographic study on the river otter, and they seem to be doing pretty good up here. And we do see them in the tide pools, and I think that they do. I don't know if they get purple urchins or not. I haven't actually seen it, but I kind of have seen caches where it looks like maybe, but I don't know. Let's see. Mary Glanville is asking, what is the status of reintroducing sea otters to the San Francisco Bay?
Oh, great. Hi, Mary. It's good to see you. Yeah, so the status is that there is no official, you know, plan for reintroduction, right? So as I described, everything about this is conceptual discussions. There was a feasibility assessment put out by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but that is not an official proposal. It was merely just saying that it is possible to do. San Francisco Bay was highlighted, especially during Brent Hughes did a paper, and I think that came out in 2019, and I can add that to the list. We'll have a whole list of things for you guys to be able to access first, the really specifics of each of these studies and researchers. But showing that, you know, hypothetically, it could really hold a lot of different otters in that bay, but there's a lot to consider for San Francisco Bay as well. So as all locations are sort of, no location's been chosen, all locations are being considered. It's on the list of sort of discussions around that. There are definitely areas in southern part of the bay, East Bay. There are reserves there. There's pickleweed habitat. I know that I just had conversations with some of Ohlone representatives that are interested in making sure that that area is considered as well. So yeah, I think at this point, the more people that want to to share or say that they want a location, make sure you put it in the survey that you guys take.
Awesome. Yeah, pickleweed is a big one in Big River Estuary, and I think in Albion as well. It's just everywhere. And the green crab, I mean, that's kind of moving up, and I'm wondering, does sea otters eat green crab? I'm taking a question out of turn because there's a lineup of questions, and I know Heather's going to have to pop off fairly soon, and I will try to get through this. And also, I don't know if it makes sense for Noyo to put all the links or just have them go to your website. Might be easier, but whatever I know there's a lot of interest, and there will be a lot of follow-up and great
Absolutely.
opportunity for conversation. And what agency would make the final call?
Oh, is that the next question, or was it green crab? Green crabs, I can say sea otters definitely eat green crabs, and that they definitely ate them through Elkhorn Slough, and so they can, when conversations of sort of introduced species and how sea otters might assist with that has been, there's been some studies, and I think if Jenna's on here, there was someone else telling me there was another talk that was going to come up or something that was looking at that as well, but I do believe that sea otters with the green crab population, Elkhorn Slough really assisted with that, and so at this point, they really aren't seen in that estuary. And then your next question was, who has the final say? That is the federal government. That is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal government.
Right. Yeah. And that green crab answer gets me even more excited because I know that they're all over the place in Big River Estuary there. So it would be, again, just another plug. So it sounds like we're going to have to do some big communication about our local estuaries in why they would be good for sea otters. Thank you, Heather, says Jerry West. Thank you to everyone and to the Noyo Center. And Mendo, sea otter reintroduction regarding the comment from the commercial fishermen. How do we feel reintroduction would affect the commercial fisheries? I must note that Morro Bay, Moss Landing, Monterey are all very healthy. So habitats are thriving habitats and thriving fisheries, examples there of the two being able to exist and actually support, right?
Yeah, so I think I tried to touch this on that one section, and really Edward Greger's work really does a great job of sort of emphasizing this. So first of all, there are different types of commercial fisheries. So we just want to make sure that, we kind of lump them all together like fisheries, and yet they do very specific things and they're looking for different things. So for example, the fin fisheries would likely have benefits from increased kelp and sort of sea otters, but the shellfish, commercial fisheries are likely to have great impacts to them. And so that has been seen in other regions. I do know that there, from my knowledge, there is no one actually doing commercial fishing of urchins in Monterey Bay. Grant, I think, could probably give a better answer to that one specifically. There is still crabbing there. And then there's also then the aquaculture groups, and that's, I touched on one slide for that too. Now that is when you're using sort of farming practices and sort of new techniques and different type of infrastructure for that. So there are different types of fisheries, and not every fishery is going to be impacted in the same way. Some will have benefits and some will not. So there are definitely costs and benefits to reintroduction, and those costs and benefits do not fall out equally across.
Great. Let's see, there looks like people were having to sign up. There's a little bit of discussion.
They had to sign up for the survey?
Sign up. It looks like there's a lot more questions, and I'm trying to be respectful of your time here and try to also get to everybody's comments. I don't want to overlook anybody. The recording will be on our website in a couple of days, and you should not need to create an account to take the survey. There's the link from Jenna, and we'll definitely have that link. And if you have to, that looks like there's a little back and forth about that. And Bob Spees is asking, translocation was tried years ago in San Nicolas Island and it failed. Where's San Nicolas?
So San Nicolas is one of the Channel Islands. And so this, I think Jenna even touched on this. So Jenna she did part of her thesis work in San Nick and on this project. So I will defer to anything from that to her, but I will say that the term and the word used failure is confusing in this. I think in media, it was termed as a failure. It had a lot of political background to that. And so I think in sometimes it's politically a failure, or like, so how they chose to term what is success was very specific sort of aspects to that. And yet biologically, I mean, now today there are over 100 sea otters that are resident of San Nicolas Island and thriving. So I think that's an example of where, you know, there, but again, even with San Nicolas, there were a lot of loss of sea otters in that as well. So there's a lot of pros and cons with translocations. And so that's why having this history what could be better, and be how we do better. Oh, did I just cut off?
You cut out a little bit, but I think we
no.
got the most of it. Jenna
Okay.
did chime in and write that down as well.
Oh, good.
And then Abby says, sorry if you covered this at the beginning, but I missed the toxoplasma consideration and reintroduction.
Is the question just, are we considering toxo? Are people in the discussion of sea otter reintroduction considering toxo? So obviously this kind of goes into the fact that if there was to be any sort of translocation or wild animals move to another location, disease, right? So disease transmission, are you making sure that individuals are healthy? And yes, so that the conversation around disease transmission is definitely an important one to be had. I know that toxo has been in the news lately, especially with that new one that's been called Coog. But I am not the most familiar with that, so I would leave that to one of the more veterinary sort of researchers that is in that sort of work group. But yes, of course, disease transmission has to be considered if you're doing any type of translocation in that sense.
Sorry. Just trying to get down. Lots of green crab in the Albion. What is sea otter death rate in translocation? And is that when they're introduced to healthier areas? Sorry, Grant has some good points, and I saw that, Steve, you bumped a question about the balance, but I am getting a little bit lost in the weeds trying to get towards the bottom of this very long list, and I don't want to overlook anybody's questions. But let's see, Steve, you were saying bumping this question, it feels important. Has there been any research done? Sorry, what?
Oh, I think my internet is starting to go a little wonky, so I might just do one more question just because I'm worried I'm going to cut out.
Perfect.
Yeah. I think you choose whatever you would prefer the final question. I'm happy if we want to collect these, we can address them after. I can add these into a document or something like that if people have questions, and I can make sure that we get them answered even if we're running out of time right now.
Okay. I think Steve is just bringing up the balance of, has there been any research done on how a healthier kelp forest would benefit fishermen? Because it's true, otters eat shellfish, but healthy kelp forest equals more fish. And I think we all kind of understand that, especially North Coast fisheries. Pretty much, I mean, everybody understands that kelp will benefit basically everything if it were, and so that I think we've come full circle in that conversation to see that.
Yeah, and if there's specifics, I will say that Edward Gregor's research that was done up in British Columbia, and he was really looking at the socioeconomic, the differences that's happening across the different fisheries, across the different communities. It's an excellent sort of portrayal of that. And as I said, in that case of what he saw and what we kind of understand now is that fin fisheries would likely benefit, that there would be more biodiversity, there would be more numbers. And so I think lingcod was one of the fin fisheries that did very well and benefited greatly. However, with that said, again, shellfish fisheries did were affected greatly and had costs associated with that study as well. So again, even everything doesn't always fall out exactly as you would think. And so it's always important to make sure that we're distinguishing between the different types of fisheries.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Do you mind clarifying the negative impacts that would occur for the crustacean fisheries?
I can do my best. I would say that, I'm not a specialist in specifically for urchins and in crab fisheries. I would say Tracy Grimes would be the best person to sort of answer that question, and her paper is more focused on crabs. But I think, again, going back to Edward Gregory's work that really was looking at the difference in how it's impacting the different fisheries financially, sort of economically, how that would be impacting them. So sea otters do eat, urchins, crabs, those invertebrates. And so they're not going to distinguish. Their focus is survival, right? You're not going to be able to tell them don't eat this or, don't eat that. And so I think that when you have a fishery that is competing in that sense, that's always going to be a bit of an issue. With that said, there's no crystal ball. With sea otters sort of helping kelp forests, there could be potential that it does benefit certain species of urchins, but sea otters do eat urchins. So I'm not going to try to sugarcoat that in any way. But what exactly would happen here in California, because it's not the same ecosystem as British Columbia where that project was done, there's a lot of questions that need to be looked at. And I think that that's why we need to have these discussions, and why there needs to be more sort of pilot studies and stuff to look at that. And I think that sort of, especially, bringing up how aquaculture has sort of been thinking outside the box and having different sort of methods or different tools or different ways to think about this has been, and is helpful too. That potentially there's ways to mitigate some of these, perceived threats and things that have happened in other areas that we know have already happened. Well, how can we start conversations and think of other ways that we could mitigate some of that is really important too.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. And Scott Mercer just points out the increased biodiversity where there are these keystone parts to it. I think that we've learned that, I think we all get that. Please forgive me if I didn't get to all of your questions. It went a little wonky there for a minute. I hope
you are also welcome to share my email. So if people have
Great.
questions specific that they truly want to know an answer to, I can direct them to the right paper or to the right information. Feel free to share my email. I had that on the last slide as well, but I'm happy to connect with everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Heather. That was phenomenal. Such a good discussion. And I hope that everybody will take some time and write this stuff down. We know our estuaries pretty well up here. It seems totally worthy to be a part of the conversation like that. And if anybody has any last questions, or maybe not, maybe we'll let you go, but we are
I'll save my husband from a toddler.
No, we just thank you for giving us this evening. It was really phenomenal, and I feel a lot more educated.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to be able to do this talk, and thank you all for coming and answering, asking questions. And like I said, it's complex, and I'm happy to answer future questions. And thank you to all that are here tonight. And please take the survey. Please make sure you're sharing your voice. We want to hear from all of you. We want to hear your concerns. We want to hear all of it.
Definitely. We'll take that survey and we'll put it on our website, the link to it for folks, and you can share this talk with others. And thanks everyone for being here, and viva la sea otters, wherever they may be.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening.